Our inaugural Bailyn Lecture is one of the most prolific, most influential, most brilliant, and most honored American historians in the second half of the 20th century. It is a personal as well as a professional honor and pleasure to introduce him to you this evening. Bud Bailyn studied English literature at Williams College, for which he received a BA degree, but developed while there an even greater interest in American history, which he then pursued at the doctoral level at Harvard University. He has been at Harvard more or less ever since, and although formally retired, he is as active intellectually as ever. Throughout his long career in Cambridge, he has achieved a glowing reputation as a teacher, seminar leader, and trainer of PhDs. Many of his former doctoral students are themselves among the leading scholars and teachers in the nation, and there are several here this evening. One of them, who's not here this evening, Jack Rakov, called being in one of Professor Bailyn's seminars a transforming intellectual experience. As a researcher and writer, Bud has been omnivorous and path-breaking. For his 1959 book, Massachusetts Shipping, 1697 to 1714, he used an early generation of IBM punch cards and sorting equipment to accomplish the necessary statistical analyses. This was probably one of the earliest examples of computer-assisted research by a historian, at least a prize-winning historian. In a book the following year, on education and the forming of American society, his argument that one had to think, as he put it, of education not only as formal pedagogy, but as the entire process by which a culture transmits itself across the generations, unstiffened what had been a fairly dreary and parochial field of history. The research that gained expression most bracingly in the ideological origins of the American Revolution, 1967, spawned a generation of scholarship. And more recently, his work has centered on the migration of peoples, goods, and ideas throughout the Atlantic world. These works, including The Peopling of British North America and Voyagers to the West, both published in 1986, together with his establishment of a series of influential seminars on history as viewed through the lens of the Atlantic world, have opened up a whole new approach to the study of early American history, one that is still very much in full bloom. Not surprisingly, such an exemplary record of scholarship and teaching and of writing has earned Bud Bailyn numerous honors, including a couple of Pulitzer Prizes, a National Book Award, many honorary degrees, including one from Clark University, the presidency of the American Historical Association, and election to the Russian Academy of Sciences, the first American to be so honored since the Worcester-born historian George Bancroft in 1867. Bud was elected to membership in the American Antiquarian Society in October 1960 and has been very active in our affairs, taking parts in conferences, serving on committees, acting as co-editor of AAS's chief scholarly contribution to the American Revolution Bicentennial, the Press of the American Revolution, and holding for a time the office of Vice Chairman of the Society's Council or Board of Trustees. I am delighted to give you Professor Bernard Bailyn, who will tonight revisit his 1974 National Book Award-winning book, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson.
One of the things John omitted was the fact that he and I edited a book together. Oh, you did? It was an interesting struggle. I don't know who won. He mentioned this a book which I did years and years ago, and then followed with a statistical study that my wife helped me with, because she really knows this stuff, about, we used very primitive statistical, technical equipment for this. There were no computers, believe it or not. There were tabulators. There's nobody here that would remember working with a tabulator. You know, punch cards, and they go over a mesh, and where there are holes, it makes an electrical Civilization and Technology and History, that book, published in 1959, I think, is cited at the beginning to show how dumb you can be. That is the starting point. Everything after that is progress. Well, I'm really very glad to be back here. I haven't in recent years been very active in the society, as I was for many years. But I kept my eye on the Antiquarian Society in a very special way, and I don't think you know about. For some years, I was on a number of granting panels, you know, money. And at the NEH and at the Mellon Foundation and elsewhere. And the Antiquarian Society, of course, makes application for funds, as do the other similar organizations like the Massachusetts Historical Society. But the difference, and I used to watch this very carefully, is that the Antiquarian Society always got the money. And I tried to figure this out. I did my little bit, but I was also part of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I tried to figure this out. And I watched my co-panel members, and I couldn't figure out whether they were saying, gee, this old dinky old place up somewhere in western Massachusetts really needs money, whereas the Massachusetts Historical Society is rich, so it's got all these Brahmins in it and all this stuff, and so they got the money. But then I revised them. I decided it was John Hench's applications that did it, and he is a gifted grant writer, if nothing else. In recent years, as you all know, there's been a flood of thorough, imaginative, celebratory biographies of the founders of the American nation, and a more remarkable group cannot easily be imagined. They formed one of the most creative circles in modern history. It's hard to know what kind of a group to compare them with. Is it exaggerated to say that they were as creative in the field of political and constitutional thought and innovation as the 17th century English political theorists had been in formulating Republican thought, or as the Impressionists would be in art, or as the Wiener Kreis in natural and social science, or the Bauhaus in architecture? I don't think so. It's hard to know who of this 18th century North American circle to single out for preeminence. Adams, who everyone reads about now, so successful a diplomat and so poor a politician, but always a wonderful human presence who brooded with penetration on the great issues of his age. Or Hamilton, who saw the future of an emerging capitalist world of market economies and helped bring it into being. He was, Talleyrand said, one of the three greatest men of the age, the others being Napoleon and Pitt. Or Franklin, that adroit, ingenious, elusive, deliberately self-fashioning icon of Americanism, for whom a new biography has been published in each of the past 3 years. Or Madison, whom no biographer has ever been able to make charming, but whom everyone respected in his own time and respects now as a world-class constitutional theorist. Or Washington, of whom we will soon have another biography, who correctly saw himself as the military creator, then the symbol and embodiment of the first modern Republican nation state. They were extraordinarily creative men, and indeed none more so than Jefferson, polymath, visionary, but also a tough and successful politician who enunciated more brilliantly than anyone else could have done the glittering ideals of the revolution, while personally mired in the human squalor of slavery. It's a remarkable circle of public men whose accomplishments have been so well known for generations, and whose papers, collections of their every recorded utterance, have been published and republished in technically improved editions throughout the 20th century. We now have the 38-volume start of the gargantuan multi-generational Adams papers, and the new and superbly edited Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and Hamilton papers, and we have the papers too of others who did not quite reach the highest mark, but who were of consequence in the pantheon, and whose lives have also been traced in detail. But amid all these triumphant celebrities of our national origins, there was one anti-hero who was the greatest loser in the Revolution, the last royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. To Adams and the entire New England political intelligentsia, he was not only, as the region's leading crown officer, a major political opponent, but the most villainous, traitorous person in the land. He had betrayed his country to the autocrats of Britain. He personified, they believed, all the corruption and the incipient tyranny that they were fighting against. Yet, as the monumental biographies of the founders were being written, and the scholarly editions of their papers were being prepared, it was Hutchinson's biography that I chose to write. And I did so for two reasons that were compelling to me. First, I found the bitter, vicious vilification of Hutchinson by the founders to be mysterious, unaccountable. It baffled me, and I wanted to explain it. No one loved his native land more than Hutchinson did. His small property in Milton, Massachusetts was, he said over and over again, to him the most precious spot on earth. No one had deeper roots in the land than this fifth-generation New Englander, whose great-great-grandmother Anne had been one of the major figures in the first years of the Puritans. Settlements, long before the Adamses, Otises, or Hancock's families had ever been heard of, and whose merchant forebears had been among the originators of the region's Atlantic commerce. He was remarkably accomplished. No American, North or South, wrote better history than he, nor had a more sophisticated historicist sense of what the study of the past was all about. When, in his exile in England, the famous Scottish historian William Robertson told Hutchinson that he refused to write the history of the English colonies because, as he said, there was no knowing what would be the future condition of them, Hutchinson replied that the future had nothing to do with it. The outcome, he said, need make no odds in writing the history of what is past. As even Adams admitted, Hutchinson knew more about monetary policy, coin and commerce, as Adams put it, than anyone in mid-century North America, and he had joined with Franklin in drafting the first plans for a colonial union. Though technically untrained in the law, Hutchinson proved to be a judicious and efficient Chief Justice of the Superior Court. In politics, he was active, bold, and forthright, but he was never a mean-spirited, vituperative, vengeful antagonist. His speeches, memos, letters, and formal pronouncements were logical, rational, cool, and cogent, which cannot be said of all his enemies. His aim in politics was to keep the peace, maintain the received structure of authority, and enforce the law in accepted traditional ways. The Puritan virtues of of self-restraint, personal morality, worldly asceticism, and above all, stubborn insistence on pursuing the truth, however unpopular or dangerous it might be to do so. These were essential parts of his personality. He was acquisitive, but not ostentatious, eager for public office, for his family as much as for himself, but careful not to overstep the accepted bounds of law and custom. Though more dutiful than colorful, and in appearance unimpressive, a contemporary called him, quote, that tall, thin, half-starved, parasitious traitor. He was intelligent, well-informed, very well-educated, and capable of clear exposition, with a writer's instinct to resolve and objectify his personal experience by writing about it, if not with Jefferson's lyrical flow, then with Madison's concision. In this sense, as I now think about it, his life was surprisingly contemplative. And the more I saw of his voluminous writings, his huge correspondence, his 3-volume history of Massachusetts that included his account of the Revolution in that colony, which he carefully edited to remove antagonistic phrases, his state papers, and his extraordinary bifocal set piece, the dramatic dialogue between an American and a European Englishman, which he wrote in 1768 but never published. The more I saw of all of this, the more impressed I was with his ability, and the deeper the mystery of his rejection, and the hatred that he inspired. But there was a second reason for undertaking the biography. When I began work on the Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, we were at the point, as we approached the bicentennial of independence, where one was distant enough from the event to view the whole of it, not foreshortened, to anticipate an inevitably triumphant outcome. One could now see, I believed, the full context of the time, all the contingencies and accidents, and understand the circumstances that constrained all involved, winners and losers, the boundaries that shaped all of their lives. One could grasp, as I wrote then in the book, the tragedy of it all. Tragedy not in the sense of sadness or of the inescapable consequences of hubris, but in the sense of limitations that bound all the actors. We were in a position to recover the uncertain experiences of the people of the time, who, unlike ourselves, did not know what their future would be, for whom, therefore, risk-taking was the key to everything they did. How to recover the uncertainty of times past by those like us who come later and know the outcome is one of the most difficult challenges that historians face. Knowing as one does the result of what were for contemporaries the bewilderments of their time, just as we have our bewilderments, we naturally write our histories by selecting from the available evidence the trail of data that leads to what we know would be the outcome, and thereby we distort the past. I could think of no better way of approaching the impossible, of recovering the indeterminacies of that distant time, than to study the losers impartially, even sympathetically, as if to withhold the outcome of history as contemporaries had had to do. To consider that the losers had been people who, if things had gone differently, might have emerged as victors, which is not to say that the losers were more worthy of victory than the winners. It's only a way of approaching the past as it actually was, unpredictable, full of clashes of personalities and interests that had no certain future. A world like ours, alive with possibilities, none of which, in the contingencies of the time could be predicted to succeed. Nothing was inevitable. The American Revolution was not inevitable. Could Hutchinson have kept a lid on the resistance in Boston and prevented it from exploding as it did? The answer is yes. The situation in Boston was inflamed, but more or less stable as late as 1771-72, when Hutchinson asked to be relieved of his governorship, which he had been reluctant to accept in the first place, and allowed to retire with dignity. And even in the tea crisis of December 1773, he might have saved the situation by ignoring the law, allowing the tea ships to depart without unloading, thus illegally but prudently preventing an irreversible escalation of conflict. And could Britain have won the military conflict? Yes. As late as 1777, after 2.5 years of open conflict, America was still fighting a defensive war, and British victory was still the reasonable outcome until the Battle of Saratoga in October of that year, and the outcome of that engagement could not have been predicted. My purpose in studying Hutchinson then was partly to explain the anomaly of his evident ability and patriotism on the one hand and the hatred he evoked on the other, and partly to recover, through studying his ordeal, something of the uncertainties, the contingencies of the time, the deeper context, the unpredictability of the age. Having previously explored at length the worldview of the victors, the triumphant ideology that we inherited from them, I hoped to look at the same transforming events from the other side, the side of the losers, whose most articulate native spokesman was Thomas Hutchinson. So, in 1974, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson was published. The reactions were interesting. I have to say, a little bit disappointing. Some American reviewers liked it, but others said that this biography of a law and order conservative who struggled against popular mobs and protesters could only be a disguised defense of Richard Nixon. Still others put the whole thing down to perversity and said that in various ways I had got the whole thing wrong. Some British reviewers were kinder. Lord Blake said, I'm happy to quote, it is one of the outstanding political biographies of modern times. A remark that warmed my heart until I recalled that Blake was a leading Tory intellectual. And J.H. Plum said it was a work of art, which is something to put on one's gravestone. Though I had to keep in mind that Plum had sponsored the lectures in Cambridge University, which were the basis of the book. And that, though liberal in many ways, he was in fact a friend of royalty and a brilliant narrator of the royals' lives and times. The book managed to win an award, and then it fell into obscurity, to be either ignored or dismissed as totally mistaken in various ways by subsequent biographers of Hutchinson. I won't go into detail. But it was this book that I thought I would go back to. When I received the Antiquarian Society's kind invitation to deliver this first Baron lecture, I do so because the reasons that led me to write the book, which I've explained in the first place, are not only still compelling in my mind, but even more relevant now in view of the flood of celebratory book on the founders and our expanding knowledge of 18th century history. Knowing more about the greater 18th century world than I did when I wrote the book, and understanding the lives and the thought of the founders in greater detail, I find the context of Hutchinson's life more complicated than I did before, and his ordeal more revealing of the forces at work in the world at large in the late 18th century. I am more certain now than when I was that it was Hutchinson, of all the American writers of the time, who best understood the established wisdom, the rock-solid, sanctified truth in matters of politics and political thought as it was then known. It was he who saw most clearly the apparent flaws in the founders' arguments, and he did his best to convince them that what they were arguing was illogical, misguided, and certain to lead to disaster. That in the long run, he was wrong is beside the point. At the time, no one could have confidently predicted that. What he wrote and what he argued with increasing passion, ultimately despair, was accurate, rational, and more logical than what his opponents staked their lives on. No Crown official in America, or indeed in Britain, argued the government's case as fully and as clearly as this dutiful, if colorless, provincial. And no one, besides Hutchinson, in the whole of colonial officialdom, could have sustained the elaborate, learned public debate on constitutional principles that he held in 1773 with the Massachusetts Assembly, led by John Adams and James Bowdoin. At the heart of that remarkable and truly important series of exchanges, and in Hutchinson's other speeches and papers, lay a paradoxical relationship between power and liberty. Hutchinson argued that Britain's power, expressed by Parliament, logically, systematically, and necessarily extended to its colonies, but that its liberties, in their entirety, did not. His opponents argued exactly the opposite, that while the authority of the Crown might extend to its dominions, Parliament's power did not, and that English liberties were as valid in America as in the realm of Britain itself. This great problem of the boundaries and location of power and liberty was the central constitutional struggle of the Revolution, and no one defined it more clearly than Hutchinson. As to power, he explained again and again, there could be no limit to the absolute authority of the King and Parliament. The Declaratory Act of 1766, asserting Parliament's full power and authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever, was a statement, he said, not of political choice, but of logical necessity. For absolute and final power, he wrote, is the defining characteristic of any sovereign entity. It could not be shared without being destroyed. In its nature, he said, by definition, it was indivisible. While Parliament would not use its power arbitrarily or unjustly, there was nothing to prevent it from doing so. Whatever it did was constitutional, since Parliament and all its enactments, together with the common law, were the Constitution. If Parliament erred, it would, for its own good, if for no other reason, correct its error, as it did in repealing the Stamp Act. The colonists' groping and failing efforts to set up limits to Parliament's power by rejecting its taxing power while accepting its legislative power, or by claiming the colonial assemblies had exclusive powers of their own, none of this made any sense. Hutchinson argued, because sovereign power was exclusive and indivisible. Was he wrong? By 1776, the rebellious leaders themselves realized that their efforts to share sovereignty with Parliament had failed. If Britain insisted that Parliament's power was either exclusive and absolute or nothing, they would choose nothing, thus precisely enacting Edmund Burke's prediction in his great speech on American taxation in 1774. Burke said in that flaming address in the House of Commons, "If intemperately, unwisely, you sophisticate and poison the source of government by urging deductions from the unlimited and illimitable nature of sovereignty, you will teach them to call that sovereignty into question. When you drive him hard, the boar will surely turn upon the hunters. If that sovereignty and their freedom cannot be reconciled, which will it take? They will cast your sovereignty in your face. Nobody will be argued into slavery." Later, in 1787, the founders themselves returned to that problem in setting up a federalist structure for the national government, which is, as you know, a sharing of power between the national and state governments which we inherit. But while the federalism they invented assigned significant power to the states, there's no question that in the end, the national government has the sovereign power. A fundamental fact of American constitutionalism, mandated not by the founders in 1787, who for political reasons wouldn't dare to write absolute national supremacy into the Constitution, but by successive federal judges who saw the logic of state formation. 200 years later, Max Weber, analyzing theoretically the logical structures of political authority, explained, quote, that a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Hutchinson had written, quote, "It is essential to the being of government that a power should always exist which no other power within such government can have right to withstand or control." Yet, for his insistence on the logic of sovereign power, Hutchinson was vilified, charged with denying his fellow colonists the rights that were theirs. But that was a minor charge, next to the firestone of condemnation that fell on him when his views on liberties were publicized in private letters of 1767-68 that were revealed to the public in 1773. That blistering and defining episode, from which Hutchinson's reputation never recovered, was apparently the product of a plan by Franklin, who obtained Hutchinson's letters in London from an unknown source, and then sent them to Boston with instructions to restrict their circulation to a few people. But he knew that they would eventually be published, and hoped, such was his plan as I interpret it, and hoped that these letters revealing Hutchinson's views, would divert the blame for Britain's repressive actions from the ministry to a few mischievous men in Boston led by Hutchinson, who, Franklin and the Boston leaders would claim, had misrepresented the colonies as a community in turmoil. But if that was Franklin's plan, it succeeded only in part, not in creating a window for conciliation between America and Britain, but in elevating himself to the status of a patriot hero in America and in destroying Hutchinson's career. For what the letters revealed was that in 1768-69, Hutchinson had written privately to a correspondent in England that it was impossible, quote, for a colony 3,000 miles distant from the parent state to enjoy all the liberty of the parent state, that it was simply a matter of fact that there would have to be, and this was the phrase that rang through the country, there would have to be an abridgment of what are called English liberties in America if the tide And if that time were lost, the defenseless colonies would be prey to all the predatory powers at work in this world of warring nations, and then all English liberties would be lost. Once those words were published, the entire colonial world, it seemed, exploded in wrath. The New England newspapers boiled with rage at this betrayal of freedom by, quote, vipers whose poison has already destroyed the health of your province and spilt the blood of your people. John Adams was outraged, in his usual way, by this, quote, vile serpent, bone of our bone, born and educated among us. His call for abridgment of English liberties was so flagrant, so Machiavellian a treason, Adams wrote, that, quote, it bore the evident mark of madness. His reason was manifestly overpowered. The indignation spread as the letters were published and republished locally, then splashed across the newspapers in almost every colony in America. Hutchinson was burned in effigy in Philadelphia and Princeton and compared to Catiline, Caligula, and Nero. But what had he actually written? Again and again, in letters to everyone he could reach, he frantically explained that he had never said or implied that he hoped that English liberties would be restricted, that he had wished it, only that it was a matter of observable fact that the colony's removal from the homeland must create an abridgment of liberties, must in a descriptive, not volitional sense. It could not be otherwise. Quote, I did not see how it could be helped, he said again and again. And as to the secrecy of these comments of his, there was nothing secretive about them at all. Had he not, in a speech to the Assembly a year earlier, said exactly the same thing? Quote, it is impossible, he had then publicly said, that the rights of English subjects should be the same in every respect in all parts of the Dominion. Nobody had read treason into that statement then. The furor had soon been cooked up by the process by which the letters had been revealed, as if it was the discovery of some deep-lying conspiracy to destroy the colonists' liberties. There is something poignant in this crisis in Hutchinson's career. Poignant because the words that had been revealed so dramatically touched on a profound reality that Hutchinson sensed, but did not or could not explain. What was it about the removal of Englishmen to distant lands that would necessitate an abridgment of liberties? The only explanation he offered was the fact that while Englishmen, at least some of them, could share in the election of those who ruled them, Americans did not, and if they did, it would have no effect. But he implied much more. The entire constitutional system, he seemed to be suggesting, was somehow involved, though he didn't know how. 200 years later, legal scholars are now able to explain more fully the deeper basis of Hutchinson's argument. And it is this. There is a profound difference, modern historians of English law write, between, on the one hand, the common law as jurisdictional, that is, a system inseparable from the immediate institutions that apply and practice and teach the common law, the Westminster courts, their circuits, the common law bar, the Inns of Court, and on the other hand, the law as jurisprudential, that is, as a rationally organized body of rules and principles defined primarily in reference to each other, not to the remedies and personnel enforcing them. In the 17th century authorities that Hutchinson relied on, above all the great jurist Lord Coke, the common law was conceived of in primarily jurisdictional and not jurisprudential terms, that is, as the craft wisdom of a particular court system that served it, and that jurisdictional system was bound to its natural roots in the realm of England and not its external dominions. While the Crown had jurisdiction over its dominions, Coke had explained, the common law courts did not. In Coke's eyes, English liberties did not follow Englishmen abroad. They went no farther than the English border. Coke never envisioned the common law, a legal historian has very recently written, as a free-floating jurisprudence that could be invoked as a shield against royal administration. Hutchinson conceived of the common law as Coke had done, as a system of licenses to sue in territorially bounded courts, not as his opponents did, as an abstract jurisprudence operative in all of the Crown's dominion. In this, which was construed by local patriots like Adams as treason, Hutchinson was a better lawyer and a better historian than his opponents, but he was a far poorer politician. He was right to this bland provincial official in other ways. In his remarkable, unpublished dialogue between an American and a European Englishman, a wide-ranging and learned exploration not only of the great public issues dividing England and America, but of universal principles of governance, he insisted in extremely well-chosen phrases that the law is not, as his opponents seem to think, a moral code. The relationship between law and morality, he wrote, was fluid. To sacrifice law for some abstract moral good, however worthy, would in the end, he wrote, destroy all law, and with it the foundation of civilized society. But is not civil disobedience justifiable morally? Yes, the European replies, but only morally. The rebel may be right morally, but the moral basis for his actions can never be recognized by the courts. And then there followed, in this amazing document, this striking passage, which Hutchinson wrote and rewrote in successive drafts with great care for every word. Quote, every individual must take the consequence of a mistake if he attempts to stir up the body of a people to a revolt and should be disappointed. In a moral view, he may perhaps be innocent, whether his attempt succeeds or not. But as a member of a political body, he must be pronounced guilty by the judiciary powers of that society if he fails. This is a principle essential to the nature of government and to the English Constitution. No contemporary American lawyer, no political thinker, until jurists like James Wilson and John Marshall would penetrate more deeply into such root issues of constituted authority. Well, at the end of the book, which is a rather long book, I attempted to explain this and hence to sum up the meaning of Hutchinson's ordeal. And perhaps I may be forgiven now if I repeat what I then wrote in conclusion. Failing to respond to the moral indignation and the aspirations that lay behind the protests of the American leaders, Hutchinson could find only persistent irrationality in their arguments, and he wrote off their agitations as politically pathological. And in a limited, logical sense, he was right. The revolutionary leaders were not striving to act reasonably or logically, demanding a responsiveness in government that exceeded the traditional expectations, groping towards goals and impelled by aspirations that were no recognized part of the world as it then was. They drew on convictions more powerful than logic and mobilized sources of political and social energy that burst the boundaries of received political wisdom. Hutchinson could not govern an aroused populace led by politicians manipulating such deep-felt ideological symbols. He could not assimilate these forces into the world he knew, and attempting uncomprehendingly to do so, he lost the advantage of his greatest assets, a deserved reputation for candor, for honesty, and a tireless and impartial devotion to the public good. Failing to carry the new politics with him by arguments that were accredited, he appeared hypocritical, ultimately conspiratorial, though in fact he was neither. As the pressures mounted, his responses narrowed. His ideas became more limited, until in the end, he could only plead for civil order as an absolute end in itself, which not only ignored the explosive issues, but appeared unavoidably to be self-serving. Well, that was my conclusion when I wrote the book. Now the question is, how does it strike me now? Well, I'm relieved to say it strikes me as reasonable. But it is, I now think, too narrow a judgment. The context, I've learned, is too limited. There is a much larger history, of which Hutchinson's ordeal is a part, a broader perspective in which to locate his efforts and failure. The stirrings in North America, in which Hutchinson was so fatally ensnared, and which would result in the independence of the coastal North American colonies, were part of much greater movements. They were local manifestations of shifts in deep-lying cultural tectonics that undermined the foundations of the whole of Atlantic civilization and led to profound transformations. 1776, the year, by the way, that Hutchinson received an honorary degree from Oxford, which happened, in fact, on the 4th of July. 1776 saw the publication of Tom Paine's Common Sense, that flaming indictment of the whole structure of the British monarchy and aristocracy. The publication, too, of the first volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which so ironically slighted the established pieties of complacent churchmen. Of Richard Price's observations on the nature of civil liberty that probed the inner nature of political liberty and proposed a Congress of Europe. Of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, also published that year, that argued for the demolition of commercial regulation and the release of personal self-interest for the common good, and of Jeremy Bentham's Fragment on Government, whose aim was to overthrow the principles of the entire British Constitution, and which introduced the radical concept of utilitarianism. The year of American independence was thus a year of challenges in every sphere of British life, in ideology, politics, religion, economics, law, and the principles of international relations. But not only British life. The entire Western world felt similar tremors that would lead, within a single generation, to widespread transformation. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the maturing of colonial societies, and the emergence of industrial economies were eroding the foundation not only of Europe's ancien regime, but of the Western hemispheres. While the Latin American independence movements would erupt only after Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, resistance to Spain's reforms, the Bourbon reforms, parallel to Britain's colonial reforms after the 7 Years' War, provoked patriotic aspirations among the Spanish-American Creole elite and demands for home rule in Latin America within an imperial commonwealth and representation in some kind of central Hispanic Cortes. At the same time, popular uprisings of the indigenous, African, and mixed-race populations erupted everywhere in Latin America. In Peru, in the rebellion led by Tupac Amaru in 1780, in Colombia, in the Comunero Revolution of 1781, in Santo Domingo, in the bloody insurrection of 1794 that convulsed the entire colonial world with scenes of plantation massacres and the threat of emancipation, and in Mexico, in the insurgency in 1810, inspired by a passion for ethnic equality. There were shifting winds everywhere, from Paris to Cadiz, from the Netherlands to Peru, from Boston to Ecuador. The entire Atlantic world of 4 continents, drawn together over 3 centuries into an infinitely complex but effective system, seemed to be crumbling. In this vast panorama of worlds in motion, the helplessness of Thomas Hutchinson, this thoughtful, rational, logical, well-informed, provincial official, clinging so conscientiously to traditional verities while the world around him pitched and churned, is a vivid symbol and a revealing symptom of the tumultuous transformation of Atlantic life as it had been known. Seen through his eyes, it was not the exhilarating, creative beginning of a new modern world, but a painful evanescence, the loss of certainty. He knew that logic and experience was on his side, but he had no way of grasping in the irrationality of his opponent's views the forces of innovation that would remake the entire Atlantic world. He could only insist sensibly, logically, and fatally that, as he put it, we don't live in Plato's commonwealth, and when we can't have perfection, we ought to comply with the measure that is least remote from it. So he was, as he said himself, a quietist, being convinced, as he put it, that what is best. In his defeat and bewilderment, one finds the full measure of the founder's creativity. For to overcome the authority of Hutchinson's convictions, which distilled the wisdom of the ages, took nothing less than the recasting of the basic structure of established constitutional and political thought. They did not succeed all at once or completely, nor did Hutchinson's beliefs immediately disappear. But the founders sensed the motion of the great cultural tides, bearing improvement, if not perfection, and propelled them forward. In their world, independence was an eruptive triumph, to be celebrated, Adams so famously and characteristically wrote, to be celebrated as the day of deliverance, with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of the continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore. In Hutchinson's world, the honor bestowed on him by Oxford on the 4th of July could not compensate for the alienation and bewilderment he felt, nor the belittlement he would endure in the years that followed as he stood alone, day after day, at the king's receptions, gray and gaunt, silently beseeching.